Our app component is looking pretty good, but before we add any more features, I want to do a little refactor to our app component. If you recall, when we initialized our state property right here a couple of videos ago, I had mentioned that there are two ways to initialize state. So I want to show you the other way that we can initialize state, because the alternate way is a method that you're going to see very frequently in a lot of blog post documentation and whatnot. So I want you to be aware of these two different ways of initializing state. Now, in order to understand this other way that we're going to initialize state, we have to talk about something called lifecycle methods. We've kind of already been dealing on the fringes or kind of the edge of lifecycle methods without really defining what they were. So in this video, we're going to start to talk about lifecycle methods. Then we'll start to refactor that state initialization right there. So let's get to it. All right. So a component lifecycle method is a function that we can optionally define inside of our class-based components. If we decide to implement these methods, they will be called automatically by React at certain points during a component's lifecycle. And when I use the term lifecycle, I'm referring to the fact that a component is going to be created and then show up in the DOM or show up on the screen of our browser. And then at some point in time, we might do something like, say, call setState, which will cause the component to re-render. And then in theory, at some point in time, a component might be removed from the DOM altogether and stop showing its content on the screen. That entire series of events is what we refer to as the component's life cycle. So these life cycle methods are functions that are called during very distinct or discrete times during that cycle. We've already seen the constructor function. That is a function that we can optionally define. If we do, it will be automatically called when a new instance of our component is created. And we've also spoken about the render method. The render method is not optional, which is unlike all the other methods on here. So the render method is the one function that we absolutely have to define. Now, technically, the render method is a lifecycle function. It gets called at some point during the lifecycle of a component. So here's what happens. We start off with the constructor being called, then the render method will be called, we return some amount of JSX, and that content then becomes visible on the screen. After that, we're going to see a series of different lifecycle methods being called at different points in time. First off, immediately after a component shows up on the screen of our browser, a lifecycle method called componentDidMount is called. So that means that if we define a function inside of our class, like right here outside of the constructor, right above the render method, if we define a method right here called very specifically componentDidMount, like so, this function will be automatically called one time when our component first gets rendered onto the screen. So we could put some amount of code inside of here to set up or do some initial data loading or a wide variety of different operations that we might want to do one time when our component first shows up. I'm going to remove that. I just want to give you a very quick example. After that componentDidMount method gets called, our component essentially will sit around and wait for an update. Remember, an update is going to come in the form of calling that setState method. Anytime we call setState and update our state, the component will re-render itself, or essentially update itself. Anytime that happens, another lifecycle method called componentDidUpdate will be called automatically. And so, once again, if we decided we wanted to, we could optionally define a function inside of here called very specifically componentDidUpdate. If we define that function, it will be called automatically any time that our component updates itself. I'm going to delete that one again as well. Then after that, our component might just sit around and wait until it gets another update. If it gets another update, componentDidUpdate will be called a second time or a third time, fourth time, however many times our component gets updated. At some point in time, we might decide to stop showing this component on the screen. We'll talk about the scenarios under which that would occur later on inside the course. So if for some reason we decide to no longer show this method, show this component, the componentWillUnmount method will be automatically called. This method would be usually used if we want to do some kind of cleanup after our component. And of course, we'll discuss under what scenarios that would occur. Now, to get a better understanding of some of these different lifecycle methods, I want to implement componentDidMount and componentDidUpdate inside of our component and just put some basic console logs inside there and just say, okay, yep, these things get automatically called at some point in time. So back inside my editor, once again, right above the render method, I'm going to define component did mount, like so. And inside of here, I'll put a simple console log that says my component, we'll say my component was rendered to the screen. We'll be really descriptive here. Like so. And then underneath that, I'm going to define a second lifecycle method, component did update. And I'll put a console log inside of here that says my component was just updated. It re-rendered. Oh, if I can spell it, re-rendered. There we go. All right, so let's then save this, and we'll flip back over to our browser, and I just want to see these console logs appear. All right, so I'm going to flip back over, and I'm going to make sure that I pull up my console, and we'll see that we already have the two console logs appear right here. So the first console log is from the component did mount lifecycle method. It's going to be called automatically anytime our component shows up on the screen. We then saw the component did update method. The did update method was called because after our geolocation request succeeded, or in this case was denied for me in particular, our component called set state on itself, it re-rendered itself, and so the component did update lifecycle method was invoked. Now, one thing I want to mention really quickly here that I did not make tremendously clear on the diagram is that anytime that component did update gets called, right before it, technically render will be called. So anytime our component updates, the render method will be called, we'll return some JSX that will be shown on the screen, and then right after that, component did update will be invoked. So in general, as I mentioned previously, the render method is going to be called many, many, many times anytime we decide to update our component. All right, so I'm going to remove those two lifecycle methods right there. I just wanted to give you a quick demonstration. We are going to re-implement component did mount in just a second, but we will type that back in when we decide that we actually need it. Now let's take a quick pause right here. I want to very quickly tell you some of the different reasons that we might use these different lifecycle methods so that you at least have some context and understanding of why we care about these things at all. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.